Hi, I'm John Stevens.
This is Matt Russell.
And this is Pod Have Mercy.
This is Pod Have Mercy.
So, I always start the podcast with
So, like right in the middle of it.
It's like, unless that's
We're
like
continuing
a
on
biblical
in
word. Therefore. So this week we're joined by Dr. Gil Rendle, who is, how would you describe him? Amazing.
Yeah,
brilliant.
He's kind of a rock star meets Yoda in some circles. You know what I mean? He's like super grounded and very wise. You know, it's like being around something that's like it's just marinated and done so much work in an area that when you engage with it, it's like, oh, that's what the taste should taste like, or that's what leadership should be like. So
yeah, he's been on the cutting edge of congregations and church leadership and cultural influence, and just I used his book Leading Change in a Congregation in my doctoral project in early 2000s. He's been writing books forever and continues to give great leadership in the United Methodist Church, but in many denominations as they think about what does it look like to live into this new future?
Yeah.
And especially right now in the midst of 2020 and pandemic, he's still giving great leadership in the midst of all this. And you're in a cohort with him.
I am. He leads a cohort of some folks at the TMF that we meet a number of times a year and bring what we're writing or thinking about to the group. And then the group spends a couple days just picking it apart, asking questions about it, deconstructing it. You know, it's a really safe place to bring some vulnerable stuff. And so, I know when the denomination, general conference was going, all the bishops were trying to kind of pulling their hair out around everything that's going on in our denomination. They reached out to Gil to say, basically, would you lead us through a process? So
teach us, you will.
Teach us, you will. That's awesome.
Matt's having technical difficulties. While he's doing that, though, Gil, I remember you and I can't remember when last time we saw each other, but I think I shared with you when I did my D-Min, I had gone through a church merger in 2002 or 3 or something like that. And so I was at Columbia, a theological seminary, and I thought I was going to do gospel and culture, again, abstract. And then we did this merger, and I decided I really wanted to dive in deep on that and to see why it was that it worked, because there were no models. I went out to find models, and there weren't any successful models for this thing. And so it really drove me into Edgar Schein and Chris Argyris and, all this systems and organizational culture. And so when I came back with my presentation, I remember Cam Murkison was like, yeah, we need some Bible in this, And I was like, dude, I got 3 years of Masters of Divinity and all this stuff. I got Bible, but I was hungry for that stuff,
That's really
how to actually lead organizations, how to actually shape and impact cultures. And then I was convinced after that was something that more pastors needed to be versed in.
Oh, yeah. But, the other thing, there's another facet to that, and that is that I can't tell you how many times I've done, kind of workshops or presentations or whatever it is. And one of the things that will happen is that someone who is closer tied to a traditional sense of the Bible will stand up and say, well, this is really good, very interesting, but it's not scriptural. It's not biblical. It's not Christian. And yet, when you step back, what we're talking about is so heavily value-based in the fundamentals of the gospel.
Yeah.
Simply by talking about community, simply by talking about honoring individuals. all that kind of stuff. And so, at first I used to feel defensive, and what I learned to do was just to hold still.
Mm-hmm.
And there were the other people in the group who would pop up and say, no, wait, this is us. This is biblical, And so, there are these measures by which we do our work sometimes, where if we can't footnote the scripture, it won't be read.
Well, that was one of the things I found, and when I wrote up my project, and Cam was telling me, we need more scripture. We need more scripture. Same sort of thing. And so I just started spending time. Actually, I guess it's not the way you're supposed to do it. I was reading the scripture through the eyes of Edgar Schein. So all of a sudden, as I'm looking at Acts chapter 10, or Peter going up on the roof and has the vision, all I can think of is, okay, here's unfreezing, here's cognitive restructuring, and here's refreezing, all right here from Edgar Schein on the rooftop. So I'm looking at this through a completely different set of lenses.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, thankfully, I've never been tempted to proof text anything I've written or said.
Well, you have a lot. See, I was trying to get to a place to, get a grade. You're not there anymore. You have a lot more success and authority established than I did at that time. I was having to follow the instructions, but it was
it's great.
It was a great exercise for me. Because I did read the scripture a lot differently. Because I did go through a season of time where I thought, well, maybe this stuff doesn't connect. But the more I've lived in it, when you think about systems thinking, I mean, that's body of Christ. That's unity. Right. That's there's so much that's tied into that. Yeah. And when you think about so I think some of the problems we face in leadership too is, I can't remember which book it is, but it was Chris Argyris, and he talks about that most of us engage in only kind of one loop of learning. We just attack the symptoms, and so we think if we fix the symptoms, we fix everything, but you don't really fix the overall structure. And so we keep going forward, just addressing the symptoms, and you have to have sort of this double loop of learning, and most people don't ever engage in that. Yeah. So that was very helpful for me to think, okay, let's take a deep breath before we just reactively, emotionally address the symptoms. Let's take a deep breath. Like you said, let's sit and wait for a minute. Let's let the delays work out, and let's figure out what's the bigger problem. What are these symptoms pointing to, in the structure, in the organization?
I think that's one of the huge challenges. Our group was talking about it over the last couple of days, that we're now in this deep cycle of uncertainty and anxiety. People just don't know where, fundamental things are going. And so in that situation, it's almost impossible to do double loop learning. Yeah. You're in the single loop. You've got to keep going. You got to keep acting. You've got to keep pushing. I mean, and so people, I hate to say it, is people don't have the luxury, but they don't see the value of holding still long enough to say, what was that all about? Yeah. Fundamental stuff. Yeah. So
there's something Darwin said, that humans are the only animals that when they are lost increase their speed. Right? And I think that's just really true when I think about the age of...
What's that? You've been talking to my wife again, huh?
Yeah, I do think there's, when you study systems and you learn about delays, and you have to allow the delays to work. You have to, and that's really hard for us in our culture, because we want the result, we want the satisfaction. I want the Amazon package delivered this afternoon. I don't want to have to wait for anything. And it's just like, but I look at it in the natural order, natural revelation of God timing. I think it's not only scripture, but wired into creation. You're not ready to go to seminary when you're 8. You're not ready to run an organization when you're 16 and you're still working out your identity. I mean, that's God's wired into us to grow and to mature. Mm-hmm. And of course, some people never emotionally mature, but
I really, looking back, I really think that, particularly when I was in the parish, I had to preach. It was a job requirement. But I've kind of determined that I wasn't really ready to preach until I was about 60 years old. That there is that gap between just knowing how to talk and having something to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Paul was.
Now you guys, I'm sure, Mandy's that hurdle around, 25 or 30, but
Absolutely.
Well, when I started in ministry and I was 23,
dear
22
Lord.
years old, man, I knew how to preach better than anybody.
I just want to go back and
I was the
apologize.
best preacher that I had ever heard in my life. I mean, there was nobody that could preach like. And now I go back and listen to it, and I go, "That guy's horrible."
You know what? I think at 23, I had not integrated enough pain. And so I was still talking out of this abstract space. And I think it takes a lot of pain and humiliation to be able to preach well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think if the way that we talk doesn't talk to people's desperation, and doesn't tap into our own, I'm not sure if the event of preaching has happened.
No.
It's amazing.
I forget exactly where I got it, but probably one of the most damning definitions of preaching is, explaining questions that people are not asking.
Right.
And I think that there's a good bit of preaching that still follows that format.
Yeah. Yeah.
It isn't connected to our pain. It isn't connected to our experience, to any kind of wisdom at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't imagine anybody in these days where we find ourselves, or just getting up and preaching on, here's the woman who lost the coin, and then next week it's the lost sheep, and the next week it's the prodigal. So without any
expository,
you can make those passages work where we are, but without any recognition of what's going on in the world around us. There's no one sitting in the pew is absent of the life of 2020.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Anyway. It kind of points to some of not some, all the work that you've done, and also your book Quietly Courageous, which is just, I think, incredibly helpful for the times we're in too. In that one of the things that you say in the book is, what if the question we now face are not the product of things gone wrong, but rather a world that has grown different. And in a world that has grown different, we don't open our doors and just have a flood of people coming in. The church no longer sits at the central space within kind of the public square as a reference point that people are coming to with purpose and meaning. Things have really become much more diffuse, and part of your argument or a summonsing is for the church to think differently about leadership, using the kind of the dictum of Einstein that the things that created the problem can't solve it.
Aren't the solution, right?
Yeah. And could you just speak to some of those components that you really feel like that the church, in particularly maybe coming out of the pandemic or in the midst of it, that we really need to be thinking about, marinating in, thinking through as a church? Because as you've said, we're not going to go back to normal. This is not we won't go back to, the next day as if, something happened and we reset it. So how do we think about these times and leadership in these times?
There are so many places to start that conversation, but let me kind of jump in at one or two places, and that is that I've been in the church for over 70 years. I've been ordained for 55 years.
Wow.
I've watched the church go through a lot, and of greatest kind of importance to me most recently is that I realized I've spent almost all of my life on institutional questions. And so one of the things that's happening because of this changed culture and the changed environment is that leadership in the church, it isn't so much that we just have to get to be better leaders or different leaders. We have to start attending to different things. And when you attend to different things, you often need a different skill set. because the question you're being asked now is asking or demanding something different of you. And so almost all of my life, it had to do with institutional questions. How are we going to fund this institution? How are we going to resource it? How are we going to get people involved with it? How are we going to manage the traditions? How are we going to make people happy? How are we going to satisfy the denomination? Almost every question about a thriving conversation that I have heard, even in the last couple of decades, has been an institutional question. All right. And so that really kind of frames it as if the leaders of a congregation are institutional leaders. And what it misses is the fact that the institution was created for a purpose. And so now we're at the point that the institution has to be subsidiary to the purpose. It used to be that if you kept your institution going, you were fulfilling your purpose because there was a lot of shared kind of consensus about what that purpose was all about. Whether we liked the way it was defined, looking back on that time, that's a different issue. Institutions are absolutely necessary. It's how we order our lives, and it's particularly how we order our shared lives in community.
Yes.
All of these are absolutely necessary for us. I think one of the formative pieces for me has been Hugh Hecklow's work, where he points out that institutions are absolutely necessary. That's the good news. The bad news is we don't trust them at all. And we don't trust them because they've earned our mistrust. And I would think, I would argue that a lot of the mistrust comes from the fact that our institutions have started to care for themselves instead of their intended purpose.
Amen.
Wells Fargo Bank,
Right.
was supposed to help people, kind of develop their own assets and their life and help them to, kind of manage their homes and all those other things that go with it. And instead, they ended up just trying to get a whole lot of accounts because it served their purpose, and I mean, that's only one example. I mean, politically, if you take a look at our institutions, they have betrayed most of what they say that they are supposed to be doing. The church, has gone down the road of abusing children and kind of absconding with money and serving its own purposes. Okay, so it doesn't matter where you look. We're now at a moment when people do not trust institutions, and yet we desperately need them in order to order our lives and to know how to be with one another. And so, I mean, and for me, this goes to the heart of your podcast. It is a non-institutional form that can be received out of an institution that is trying to help people order their lives. All right, now that's living on the edge in between the institution that we need,
Yes,
and the capacity that we need to learn how to engage people around the purpose of that institution.
Yeah.
And people are coming, I mean, I think that this is a generational thing in many cases, that people are wanting what our institutions have and want to engage them in a much less institutional way.
Yeah.
But we were talking about leadership. And so, my argument in the book and in other places where I am is that if that is some description of our situation, and that's only one way of looking at our situation, but if that's some description of our situation, leaders certainly need a different set of ideas and a different set of skills in order to engage that. And so, let me stop there. But I mean, that's a part of what really is on my mind at the moment.
That's one of the things that you have really helped me with, because I think that early on I might have been more of a burn it down person. Let's go and just and the more I have been around and have read your work and have been around some of the things that you've crafted and created, none of the things that I do kind of in the outside of Sunday morning makes sense without the institution of the church and without the institution really I'm United Methodist, right? And so the things that I'm doing and the things that even that we're doing, as a part of the mission of Chapelwood don't make sense to me outside of being connected to Chapelwood. That connection, whether you talk about center or edge, that umbilical cord and lifeblood, I think in a bi-directional way, is super important. And those relationships have become more important to me rather than less, which is really interesting.
Okay. So you're kind of tapping into another issue here for me, and that is, that thriving organizations, thriving organisms of any form need to have permeable boundaries. They need to be able to have a boundary that allows energy or resources in and energy and resources out. And so during the period of growth that we started in the 1950s, we began to develop institutions that had clear boundaries, but were not permeable. If you came in, you had to come in under our rules. Okay? If you don't follow our rules, we will expel you across the boundary, but you don't have the freedom to do it other ways. You can't go back out and just do it the way you want. You're either in or you're out. I mean, think about, all that we know about ordination in any of our major denominations. There is a guild that you have to join by following the rules. And if you break the rules, you are out. That is not a permeable boundary.
Right.
But thriving organizations have permeable boundaries. They allow people in, they allow people out. You can do it our way, but if you are still working on our purpose and would rather do it your way, that's okay. I mean, this is that whole thing about, we ended up defining thriving by institutional standards, and mostly by counting resources. How many people do you have? How much money do you have? How good are your buildings? That kind of stuff. That in some sense, thriving is not whether or not you can get a lot of resources. Thriving is, can you live in your environment? And systems have to be adaptable. From a systems point of view, the principle is learning how to be steady in purpose, but flexible in strategy. When your environment changes, can you still do what you do, but do it in a very, very different way that now, kind of lives in that environment? Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. And I'm thinking in terms of a lot of churches that I've either worked with or known, like from South Georgia or really across our denomination, that are churches that, like you said, have very, we've located them now on the public square. They have walls. You have to go in to receive the ministry. They might have a food pantry, but even that, I would say, is a little doorway where they go out and sort of feed the community, but there's still a wall there. Sometimes those people are not even allowed in.
Right.
And also the unwillingness to change. I remember, just thinking in terms of change management and what level of survival anxiety is present in the system. And it's funny to me that there's so much anxiety in the system, but apparently it's not enough. What was it? It's the learning anxiety. So the survival anxiety is like really high. People are afraid they're not going to make it, but they can't envision themselves living into that new future. And that's so scared to them. They can't understand what that would look like for our church to have permeable boundaries. And so because they can't get there, they can't manage that psychological disconnect. So they just sit there and they just wait to pass on into where they don't exist anymore. That's where I see a lot of churches, and they're holding fast. Either they're holding fast saying, we will stand our ground, and, God, whatever the culture, that's it. And other people are like, I'm just too scared to move, and we'll just shelter in place, and last one out, turn out the lights kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's go to one of my favorite recent case studies, if you want to think about it that way. And this comes from a friend of mine who's an executive in the Presbyterian Church, and he was an executive over a really dense urban area that had been under tremendous stress. And so he had this little congregation. Maybe they were down to maybe 30 people in average attendance, or even maybe less than that. And they're wondering what they're going to do. They're losing their resources. They're down to a quarter-time pastor. They're not sure if they're going to make it. They've got a huge building. They have another manse, another building, which is the house for the pastor when they had the pastor, and they have a plot of ground in between. So one woman says, well, while we're waiting to figure out what's going to happen here, how about if I take that plot and turn it into a garden? So she got a couple of people going with the garden. Okay. Now, the really critical piece was she developed from her little group of folk 2 sets of volunteers. The one set of volunteers, in fact,
is shaky.
Okay, thanks. We might still be having problems with the internet here, but she set one group of volunteers to grow the vegetables, and then she worked with a second group of volunteers to talk to people who came to get free vegetables from the neighborhood. So in other words, they put up a sign, 10 o'clock Saturday morning, come on over, you can take whatever free vegetables you want. And she worked with those people not to give the vegetables away, but to talk to people while they gave them away. And she essentially just had this genius impulse to say, when you're talking to them, ask them what's important and what they're concerned about. Okay. From that came a tutoring program that the church was a center of, and a whole bunch of other things. Okay, but what she had done is that she shifted the agenda and the agency from the congregation to the neighborhood.
Yeah, there you go.
That instead of worrying about do we have enough agency to bring people into our church? That was their question as a congregation. She flipped it around and she said, we've got to learn what is the question that the neighborhood is trying to answer, and what can we bring to that?
That's so good.
So she just flipped agency, flipped, the whole agenda. And suddenly they had people showing up. They were growing in worship, and that was not their goal at that point. All right. But they then started a tutoring program. They brought in kids from the local university, to be the tutors. They were thriving. They had all these community meetings and stuff like that. And then they called a new part-time pastor who was a retired jazz musician. And his take on the whole thing was, well, that's all interesting. It's nice to see that, but we could get a whole lot of people here if we started to have jazz worship. And he put all of his time and energy and the resources of the church into jazz worship, which was whose issue?
His.
It was his issue. He brought the agenda back into the church. And they had a couple of people showed up. They liked jazz music, and the rest fell apart.
Yeah.
A lot of this is I think, learning, where is the agenda of mission, of ministry, of healing, of justice? And it's usually not inside the institution.
That's right.
The institution is the infrastructure that allows you to address that. But those issues are living outside of us,
which is
not inside. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
yeah.
It seems counterintuitive, but because you think, one of the things I know that you say is that courageous leaders allocate resources to people. And if the institution is really kind of thinking only about itself, it's counterintuitive. But once you begin to do that, it opens up the highway, and what you've wanted, which is to be a viable, vibrant community in your neighborhood, happens. But it doesn't happen when you're trying to preserve your own resources. It happens when you begin to think outside of that, it seems. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think it's interesting now because, you know, you tell that story of a particular church, and I remember a church in Columbus, Georgia, that I was working with on a committee task force, and it was a little older, you know, Anglo-white church, and it was in an African-American community that had a school across the street, a lot of young families, a lot of kids, and they knew exactly who was in their community. Yeah. They knew exactly what it was they were looking for. They knew exactly what the needs were, and they stayed with what they wanted to do, and ultimately it died. I mean, they had to close the doors because they were not willing to listen. I mean, they were listening, but they were not willing to make those changes. Yeah. They still wanted everyone to come and be with them the way they were. And I think that's going to be a hard part of I like the idea of permeable boundaries, and it's interesting to me. Talk a little bit about just where we are now with the pandemic. How do you think this is going to cause churches to really be maybe more open or less open? Or are you seeing or sensing that there's a radical revolution going on through that? Or I also get the sense that there's just as many people that just are sheltering in place and can't wait to get back to the way it was before the pandemic. What's your take right now?
No, I think you're probably absolutely right with your description that the overabundance of congregations are just kind of treading water, waiting to get back. It's been kind of an interesting. I wrote a short paper not too long ago at the beginning of the pandemic, and the kind of idea was that nature just abhors a vacuum. And that when you can't do what you've always done, suddenly these things rush in to fill that space, and it can be really creative. When I watched the congregation that my wife and I, attend, when we had to transition to Zoom, we went to a Zoom platform to do worship. We had to give up everything we knew, and suddenly there were like 3 people who were not particularly leaders in the congregation in the old form, simply stepped up, and they just kind of carried us over the bridge. And the young woman who knew the most about technology, not only got us on the platform, she started to do pastoral care during the sessions. What she did is she simply became herself. But now there was space for herself. Okay, and so these things just naturally happen. Okay, so even if it isn't massive change, these really healthy things were starting to happen simply because we couldn't do it the old way. Now, the longer we're in that setting, it's like everything else that, our patience has grown thin. We want to go back. This is the call of nostalgia. We got some folk, who are in the conversation who are insisting that they go back into the pew in order to listen to the choir. Well, that's going to happen. And so what I think we're looking at is that we were already on track to lose, maybe up to 30% of our congregations over the next couple of decades within just the United Methodist system. They were not going to maybe make it, through the transition in the culture. That 30% may now be 50%. Who knows? The deep desire to go back is another misstep that keeps us from moving forward. Yeah, and so we're going to lose even more.
Right. That's right.
And even the forms that we had before are going to have less response. People are, Matt and I were just in a group of church leaders, not to be named, who are now talking about how they're migrating around the internet for their worship. They may not even stay for the whole worship service when they, this is known as lurking in other places. You just got to love this stuff. But what that says is that the way people are going to engage us, even when we go back, they're not going to come and sit for an hour.
No.
Not if they can get what they're really asking for in 20 minutes by searching around.
That's right.
What's going to be required is going to be really different here.
Yeah. I don't think we ever lose gathering people together, because I think there's a human, like you said, we're created for community, but what we're going to find is that there's going to be a generational change on how the needs of community are met. And so, I hear so many different things, and I think a lot of it's hypothesis at this point. But like, think about our entire young generation that's coming along and has lived through 2020. There's some people that are saying they're going to detest online worship because it's going to remind them of a pandemic. They're going to want to experience community in a different way. I don't know if that's true or not, but it could be. And I've also talked to a lot of people who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, even 50s. They have children, and they're really enjoying this on-demand spiritual formation from their church. They can consume it at 11:45 on Sunday, or 7:30 a.m., or Monday evening together, or separate. Even they might be in different rooms. I mean, it's like something that, as a pastor now with almost 30 years in this thing, it's like it can't work that way. It can't work that way. We got everybody in the room. You got everybody together. We got to get everybody. And so it really does assault your expectations and your assumptions. You talk a lot about managing, assumptions about things, that we have to adjust those sort of things.
Yeah.
And expectations. Who was it, the guy that said the secret to happiness is low expectations? And I think that we're going to have to adjust our expectations and our assumptions about what really is spiritual connection, making disciples, instead of at an abstract level. It's going to look specifically very different now and coming out of the pandemic.
Yeah, it is. And this is where, I really, I'm trying to challenge leaders and to get them out of problem-solving mode. One of the things that I've worked with the bishops in the church for a long time is that they have to learn how to lead boldly without knowing where they're going. And that's because every time you come up with an answer, it creates your next problem. Okay. And so if you go out there and boldly say, here's the answer, come follow me, you are now leading people into the next problem. And so if you're not willing to take that trip and say, I don't know where we're going, but when we get there, we'll figure out the next step.
That's right.
Okay. Now, think about, and the reason I'm saying this is, part of where we're going here is to say that we have to do a new thing, as if we know what the new thing is.
Right.
This digital worship that we're learning how to do is not the solution. No. It's going to create the next problem. Mm-hmm. I've really been taken by Bill Dunkelman's work on the vanishing neighbor. And he basically, and he's working off some really old anthropological theory, but that we have organized ourselves at different levels. And so for each of us, there is an inner circle of people who are those that we have the tightest relationship with. Mm-hmm. This is our group, our family. These are the people who are on speed dial on your phone, and the people you email the most. These are the people that you really stay in touch with. Around that is the next ring or the next circle, and those are the people who are kind of like you. They kind of fit the mold of the people that you relate to and everything. And you often think about them as your community and so forth. And then the third circle out there is everybody else. This is the big circle. Okay, and they are all different people. All right. So one of the things that Dunkelman is working on is what happens when social media and when technology come into that. And where he's able to point to is that we now go to two of those three circles. We either go to the inner circle or we go to the wide circle. And we have no contact, almost no contact in the intermediary space. Mm-hmm. There's somebody else who pointed out that if you take wherever you live, and put that in the center, there are 8 other residences around you if you make a square of 9. So you would be the middle square. We okay so far?
Yes.
I'm not good at math, but I'm following you.
Carry the 2.
Okay. So if you're in that middle square of this block of 9 squares, that overwhelmingly, maybe 90% of the people don't even know the names of the people who are in the other 8 squares around them. Okay, we have almost lost our connection.
Yes. Yes.
So I translate that, if I'm watching my grandkids play soccer, I'm like the rest of the parents and the rest of the grandparents. While the game is going on, we're all standing on the sideline, and we're all really engaged with what the kids are doing, and we're yelling and kicking the ball imaginarily with our own foot and all that other kind of. We're really engaged, and then it comes to halftime, and there's all these people standing on the sideline. And the one thing that they tend not to do is to turn and talk to each other.
Yeah.
Instead, what they do is they pull out their cell phone and they go to the internet or they go to the email. Well, where are they going? Either to the center circle with the email to the people that they always talk to, or they're going back out, to
Twitter.
Going
Yeah.
Google the cast of their latest favorite movie. But what they don't do is they don't talk to each other. Okay. So what I'm trying to get at here is that, for all that we want to be able to say that we now are moving toward our next solution, no.
Very interesting.
We still haven't even broached this issue of how do we connect people in community.
Yes.
Institutions are built for mediating space, for that middle ring of how are we going to, Brueggemann has said that at every time in the crisis of Israel's life, they had to ask 2 questions. How will we now be with God, and how will we now be with one another?
Yeah.
All right? That question of how will we now be with one another is really unresolved in this latest pandemic. We have not figured that out. And so, the institution is the infrastructure by which we can address that. And we have to learn how to do it in new ways. But I don't think we're getting an answer out of this yet.
Gil, do I hear what you're saying, though, is we may not know the how, but is part of the purpose of the institution to summons us into that space that creates or helps to negotiate or rebuild, or it may not even be a rebuilding, but to constitute that space of neighborliness? Because that space. Yeah. Okay. And so then the institutional call is to be, and John and I were talking about this a bit ago, that it seems that all theology, all church is really contextual now. And not just context around who's sitting in the pew next to me, but really then helping to equip our folks to think neighborly. To really reconstitute a sense of what it means to be neighbor in folks across the street and really even across the highway, to really begin to think that. Is that part of the purpose of this next phase?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Part of the purpose. Okay. I'm really, and this is in some sense not just what I'm thinking about is going on with the church, but I'm also thinking about where I am in my own life, and this notion that the 2 great commandments. Jesus was asked, "What is the greatest of the commandments?" And his response was, "Well, there's 2. Love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself." Okay, and so there have been some theologians who say that when that happened, Jesus was not saying, "Well, here's the top 2." If you're going to prioritize all the commandments, pay attention to these first. Now, Jesus goes on to say, on these 2 commandments hang all the laws and the teachings of the prophets.
Yeah.
That they are the fundamental of the faith on which everything else is built. All right. So how will we be with God, and how will we be with one another? There's a number of theologians who are now looking at the 10 Commandments not as if they are moral law. If I follow these 10 Commandments, I will then be a good person as opposed to being a bad person.
Right.
the theologians are now beginning to address these as saying, no, this is the way that Israel was being taught.
Yes.
To be both faithful to God and faithful to community.
Yes.
You shall have one God, and here's how you're going to relate to each other.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm saying here is that at this stage of my life, I'm beginning to realize how fundamental my faith is to be able to address how we can live with one another, and that my church has something fundamentally important to teach the world I live in.
Yes.
Okay, we've got, in my mind, what the world deeply needs to be able to sort out a lot of our dilemmas.
That's really good.
But it has nothing to do with saying you're a good person, you're a bad person, and it has nothing to do with saying that you have to follow our doctrines or our traditions. It is, if you want to walk with us, we can help you to change your life as an individual in a better form. And if you walk with us, you can be part of a community that can be healthy. Those are really different approaches.
That's right.
So I don't know. You all tell me whether I'm making sense or not. But
No, I love it. It's like everything. The pendulum swings.
Yeah.
And I think like you said, coming out of the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, even till today, everything was rooted around facades on Main Street, and they were social centers, geographic, spatial locations. And now I think we're if you want to call it postmodern or post whatever, fill in the blank, we're actually moving away from the static way of thinking about church, like you're saying, and really, everybody talks about getting back to like first century, Christianity. I mean, I think it's ancient Judaism, Judeo-Christianity. It's back to focus on what the purpose is. And I think we just went through a season in our culture where everything was very institutionally laden. Politics, schools, the way we do education, the way everything was built around institutions. Well, that was a season, and we're still trying to force things into that model. That model doesn't exist anymore. People are not, like you said, they don't resonate with that model. Some generations do, and they long for that. They long for everything to be like that always. But I can tell you, people who are in my kids in their 20s and their 30s and even 40s, they have no concept of that. They didn't come up with that. They came up with a deconstruction of all that. And so they're looking for spirituality. I think there's a great hunger, and we just have to be careful to not, provide the table and the place setting, like you said, through the institutional models. We have to be willing to listen and say, all right, it's like potluck. Everybody bring your own stuff, but then we're going to provide the picnic table out in the garden, wherever that garden may not be in our building, maybe across town, but we're willing to come and help create the community, because we can do that. That's what I hear, you saying, and that's what I get the sense that there's hunger for. People are hungry for connection, because social media technology has served a profound purpose of importance. We know more than we've ever known before, and yet we know less about certain things. And we're more connected than ever before, and also more disconnected from personal relationships.
Right. There was, and I don't talk about it much, and it certainly doesn't show up in my writing a whole lot, but one of the things that has captured me for a long time is the notion of a deep generalist. And this is a kind of a leadership framework, but the notion of an expert is someone who has, become deeper and deeper in their knowledge about less and less. That they are specialists in a particular area. And so if that happens to be where your question is, the one thing you need is an expert. They can tell you whatever you need to know. A deep generalist is quite different. A deep generalist is someone who dove deeply into their own discipline to understand their discipline at depth, so that at the surface they can look broadly.
Beautiful.
And offer a different perspective. They're not saying that, I can help you by making your problem what I know about. They're saying, let me lend what I know about to help you understand your problem. It's a reproach. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it seems like a big Jesus way of doing it, because what I hear you saying is that it's not about solving problems. It really is about a new way of seeing. Right. And once I see what is new, then and even we have to move forward without even knowing what we're seeing. Right. That's where I think the institution says, you tell me what you believe and I'll tell you if you belong. And Jesus comes along and says, come and see. Right. And so that's a different, that's a different way. Right. And I think that we're at that place now where I think, at least within congregations, people are asking for more certainty and for more security. But we live in a world that's offering less and less. And the institution can provide us a way of saying, let's look at this differently. We need to move differently into the future that God's calling us to. Right. So our security is not necessarily in what we have, in what we own, but our security is in a set of relationships that are calling us, that actually provides a lot of disruption. So that's there's a paradox in that, right? There's this disruption and there's this like freedom,
Right.
And both are true.
But, I mean, just bring it back around then to what we're talking about in terms of institutions. What our leaders, what we need from our leaders in our institutions, our churches, and what we need from our church is that they start behaving like degeneralists. Yeah. That they go deep enough into their own disciplines and their own teachings so that they are fully aware of what is there, so that they can come up and engage people on this breadth of experience and say, let's look at it through this lens. Can you see what I see? Not here's your answer, but can you see what I see? That's really different.
Yeah, the unfortunate thing is we still have a lot of churches, and I'd say they're in all denominations, and ours as well, where I would say this purity and dogma, this right thinking has elevated in certain ideological form. And, I just think as I look at the life of Jesus, that was not the priority. That was not the main, like you said, the love of God, love of neighbor. It was all about the connection of relationships. And so, when you're moving in a direction where you're drawing the circles more clearly and definitively, it's like, what was the saying? It's like when you start drawing circles around yourself or around your belief, you'll never be able to draw them small enough at some point. And I think that's the society is looking at that. I just think it's the wrong way to tack the boat and move in that direction. I think love is more expansive, and it doesn't mean that what you believe doesn't matter. It just means that you have a greater sense of relational tolerance around disagreeing intellectually, because if fundamentally the relationship and the connection is of supreme importance, my relationship with God, my relationship with you, that's going to reframe the limitations of you and I don't think alike.
That's right.
You voted for X and I voted for Y. Well, why can't we still be connected in a healthy way? So
That's right. Yeah.
Well, what are you doing for Thanksgiving?
We're making a very small meal for 2 people.
Are you?
Sure. Yeah.
A lot of people are doing that. That's a lot of people.
We have 2 sons. I have 2 sons, and between their families, we have 6 grandkids. One of those family lives nearby. The other is in a different part of the country. Even with the ones nearby, I think the virus has jumped by about 800% in our county over these last couple of weeks. So we're hunkered down. We're going to stay.
I got you.
And we'll do what other people are doing.
Well, I think there's a lot of people that are doing the same thing. You know, in Houston, we've been fortunate, but we're starting to see some uptick here. A lot of this is, you know, it's sort of moved around the country. It started in like New York and West Coast, and then it came down here to Houston and New Orleans, and now you see it in the Midwest and places that are rising up. But it's, you know, I think being careful. My mother was going to think about coming over here for Christmas, but now she's thinking she's probably not going to do that. And so we're going to be Zooming together, I'm sure, you know, on the holidays, which will be different. But well, I pray for you a safe and healthy and happy Thanksgiving. Any wise parting words for us before we go?
No.
I think you had a lot of wise words this whole day.
None that we can repeat here, probably.
Right. My father-in-law used to always tell the story that when he and his wife were out socializing, he was the one who always got tired of the gatherings before she did. So he would always say, Jane, what do you say? Meaning, let's go. And she would always respond, well, save your money. You know, what do you say?
Save your money.
I have no wisdom.
No, you do. Well, listen.
Thanks for inviting me into the conversation. I
and
appreciate what you're.
We will definitely invite you back. I think this conversation, this was when we started this podcast, it was around these types of things that we really wanted to think about, pushing the envelope different. And of course, it was only a couple of weeks after we started that, you know, pandemic hit. So that changed a lot of the framework this whole year that we've been doing. But this is, as we start getting towards vaccine and thinking about that rolling out, I think it's really important. The church, I hope, is having conversation and been having conversation about what it looks like to come out on the other side. Because I'm just afraid everybody wants to go back to the way it was. And I think that's a dangerous and scary thing for us to think about doing.
Yeah, well, TMF is trying to mount some of that conversation with what they're doing. And I think that they will have some conversation partners. But again, you know, it will be probably only with those people who are attracted to those conversations to begin with.
Yeah.
No, it's there's a lot more beyond that.
Yeah.
Well, we appreciate you, praying for you for a safe Thanksgiving and Christmas.
Well, thank you.
Y'all stay safe.
And you as well. Yep.
Gil,
Thank
thanks
you.
so much. Blessings
Thanks.
to you.
Bye-bye.
Be in touch.
All right. We'll see you.
Bye.
He's a pretty smart fella.
Yeah, I'd like to have him on.
You need your mic back.
Oh, sorry.
Do we have to do the...
I'd like to have him
There's
on.
like this
a
thing
lot.
we do
That's
every
right, I
week.
forget.
It's like the ending. Yeah. It was like, too much coffee for you, bro?
I'm like, out.
I'm done. Mic drop. It's the mic twist.
I'm gone 1 week and I forget how this works.
But I think this is the starting point of a conversation that when you think about the new digital sort of thing that we're doing that's going to morph into worship experience, you know, that's one of those permeable things that I see. And it's like so many things that I can see when he talks about that. I see at Chapelwood where that's working already.
Yes.
And how at the food pantry they're listening to people. We know like where people are as far as rent, evictions and where they are in their lives and what their fears are. And I think that's fascinating to me.
I do too. I feel so blessed that we have access to folks like Gil who are teaching us how to think, not necessarily what to think. And I think that that's the skill set that the church is needing to go into the future, to be faithful to this Jesus that's already moved on, is in the future, calling us to it. And so faithfulness does not look like doubling down on the past. It looks like asking, where is God, where is my neighbor, and how do we be faithful to both of those?
It's a good ending word. I'm John Stevens.
And I'm Matt Russell.
And this is Pod Have Mercy. Now you can drop the mic and walk away.
Thanks, swing it.